Hello, welcome back to the Bio 122 lecture videos. This is video number 28 on the urinary system in the human, and this comes from chapter 41 from your textbook. So specifically, the human kidneys are located on either side of the vertebral column. They both carry out the same function. They're located just below the diaphragm, and they are in the most dorsal portion of the abdominal cavity. So they're behind the intestines. They are each connected with a ureter to the urinary bladder, which lays much further down in the abdominal cavity. And urine is produced in the kidneys and is then stored in the urinary bladder to be voided through the urethra. Now, sitting on top of the kidneys, as noted here, is also the adrenal gland, but that's actually a completely different organ from the kidneys themselves. The adrenal gland is part of the endocrine system. They just happen to sit as a cap on top of the kidneys, but they're not a part of the function of the kidneys that is going to be described here. They're just nearby. If we take a kidney itself and cut it in cross section, we see that, well, it has a rich blood supply, as it must. It has an artery coming directly off the aorta, which is providing blood, and of course, in this case, oxygenated blood, but really the important thing is this blood is carrying waste material, metabolic waste material from the entire body, because the function of the kidneys is to be removing the waste, the metabolic waste from the blood. So they act as a filter. So the renal artery comes in and then branches into arterioles, into capillaries. So there is a capillary bed inside the kidney, because the only way that you can exchange substances back and forth between the blood and the body fluids is through the walls of a capillary. So the capillaries are located in the most superficial layer, which is referred to as the cortex. Cortex is one of the three layers of the kidney, and it's the outermost layer. The capillaries, therefore, are found in this layer, so that must be where the exchange of substances is occurring. But they also, notice right here, they kind of extend down into these structures that are called renal pyramids. The blood vessels themselves circle the renal pyramids. The renal pyramids, as we're going to see in a minute, contain the major structural functional unit of the kidney called the nephron, which is then, and then the blood system surrounds that. So then leaving the capillary will be a vein, and so the renal vein is going to carry the newly filtered blood back into the systemic circulation and join up with the vena cava. Meanwhile, the urine, which is the waste product being removed, is going to be formed in and collecting in the renal pelvis, the innermost layer of the kidney, where it then drains into the ureter, which I mentioned before, carries it down to the bladder. So let's zoom in a little bit more in the microscopic level, while also looking at the big picture. So again, here is the excretory organs of humans, the two kidneys, and then the aorta carrying blood to the lower part of the body, and the first branch, or the branch coming off here, the renal artery, and then the posterior vena cava carrying blood back up to the heart is going to be carrying the newly filtered blood. The kidneys are draining the ureters into the urinary bladder, and the urethra is how the waste material will be voided in the form of urine. But if we zoom in a bit, again, here is our picture of the kidney structure with the cortex, the medulla, and the pelvis. But more importantly here, if we take a little section here out of these pyramid-shaped structures together with the cortex, we start to see an indication of the microscopic anatomy of the kidney in this major structural unit called the nephron. There is a portion of the nephron in the cortex, and then a portion that descends down into the medulla part that bridges between the cortex and the medulla. So that's called the juxta, so juxta between, juxtamedullary portion. So the nephrons exist within the renal cortex and the renal medulla. The blood supply, though, is going to be primarily restricted to the renal cortex portion of the nephron. So let's continue magnifying the nephrons. So here we have the renal pyramid and the nephron with the cortex and medulla. And if we kind of take that out and look at it separately, what we have is the nephron is shown in yellow here. And it's this structure that has a convoluted, twisted tube shape, which you may recognize by the general feature of animal physiology is that we increase surface area by making these convoluted surfaces. So we have a greater surface area within a very limited volume, maximizing our ability to, instead of exchanging nutrients, we're trying to exchange waste. And we also have to have the blood supply, and the blood supply comes in through what's called the afferent arteriole and delivers blood to a capillary bed that exists inside this kind of hollow structure that's called the glomerulus. This is where the filtering takes place. And so the best way to filter the blood is actually just to simply remove pretty much everything. So these capillaries in here have a very, very loose structure. So pretty much anything dissolved into the blood will leak out and form the initial filtrate, which then will continue through what's called the proximal convoluted tubule. You can see why it's called convoluted. It's wavering back and forth. But then the blood vessels gather back together and they actually completely surround the nephron with capillaries. So there's actually two sets of capillaries here, one inside the glomerulus, and then more capillaries that completely overlie the acting nephron, so that we can have multiple points of exchange of nutrients and then moving water back and forth and removing ions and other substances. So there's different functions along the track of the nephron depending on where you're at. And then eventually we get to the collecting duct, which will join all the nephrons together to eventually direct urine to the renal pelvis, which then collects it and sends it through the ureter to the urinary bladder. So let's continue thinking about the functions that are happening within this nephron. And so here's another picture of it, kind of showing a bit more detail of what happens inside the glomerulus. So here's the artery carrying unfiltered blood in, and the glomerulus and what's called the glomerular capsule, also named Bowman's capsule, is this structure that just completely envelops the capillaries so that there's an exchange of waste products being filtered out, and the fluid that's in this Bowman's capsule, all of this referred to as the glomerulus. Well, the glomerulus is actually the blood capillaries. The glomerular capsule is the structure that surrounds those capillary structures, is where the initial urine is being formed. And this will be all inside the nephron. It's now isolated from the rest of the body. So again, we can kind of see how the blood continues back around, and then we have capillaries surrounding the nephrons at certain locations where we eventually collect the blood back and then go back into the renal vein. So here's another example of just another picture showing the glomerulus. And we have here kind of in these dark arrows, waste products that would be leaving because of blood pressure. That's what's shown in the red arrow, black arrows is blood pressure. We also have forces of osmosis depending on the blood concentration. So we have net filtration going back and forth, but in general, we want to exude substances from the blood. Here's an actual microscopic photograph showing the blood vessels in a human kidney. And the yellowish thing here is the actual glomerulus. So that would be the beginning of the nephron itself. And this shows how closely integrated and overlapping the circulatory system is with the nephron. But now let's just talk about, can we kind of simplify this and talk about what's happening at the nephron? And one of the easiest ways to do it is to kind of just think about this in a modular form by straightening the whole nephron out and not dealing with all the convolutions anymore. Because from the point of view of the filtrate, it's just passing through this tube, and we have the capillaries lining nearby it. And so we can kind of break it down into three major steps of filtering, where we begin with filtration in the glomerulus. So as the blood comes in and it enters the glomerular capsule here, what happens here is that we just basically remove almost everything from the blood. And of course, we want to remove waste materials, but it's very difficult to know in advance exactly what waste may exist. So the easiest solution seems to be, let's just take out everything. And that is pretty much the case. Even our good stuff, even our nutrients, even glucose, even amino acids, even proteins will be filtered, except for the larger proteins. But all the minerals, the vitamins will be filtered out. And then what we have is a lot of good stuff in the filtrate together with the bad stuff. So we would like to get the good stuff back because we put a lot of energy into absorbing that through the digestive tract. So the next step is we are going to start reabsorbing the good stuff. And so ions, water, and nutrients will come back into the blood. The reason we do it that way is because we can actually just use the exact same transport mechanisms that we used in the digestive system, because we know what an amino acid looks like, we know what vitamins look like, we know what glucose and things like that are. So it's pretty easy to just reabsorb those things. But we don't know what all the waste products look like, but that's okay. We don't want to reabsorb them. So now we're starting to get the filtrate has primarily waste products, but we have one more step along the way, is that now the third step is we start paying attention to osmolarity and also pH. So pH, of course, is the number of hydrogen ions in the blood. And so if there's too many, we can actually pull hydrogen ions out, or if the blood is not acidic enough, we can put ions back in or keep them in. And the major thing, though, we're doing is we're going to start balancing sodium and potassium, because that is the primary way, using those two electrolytes, that we can control osmosis. So we can end up balancing the amount of osmolarity in the blood by regulating exactly and very precisely the amount of sodium ions in the blood. So in this way, the kidneys do two major functions for us. They remove metabolic waste from the body so it doesn't become toxic to us. And it also handles that job of osmoregulation for us by balancing sodium, potassium, and water levels. So a quick way I like to summarize this is, again, there's kind of 3 steps the nephron is doing, but we can also add a 4th one to the total process. That what happens is basically we remove everything, and then we put the good stuff back. We regulate osmolarity and the pH, and then what's left we excrete as urine. So that would be the 4th step. So that's the end of this section, giving a quick summary of the human renal system. Take care.